Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics. So basically, Book 1 leads off with Aristotle sort of being like, politics, am I right? What even is it? We will go through it systematically and we will figure out every component of what makes politics. He's not quite as aggressive as that, but you know what I mean. So basically, Book 1, as one might reasonably expect for the first book of what's going to be a fairly extensive treatise, sets out to figure out what the subject actually is and how to approach it. So it's worth noting, politics is divided into 8 books. Each book is divided into multiple chapters, and each chapter deals with its own particular point or its own particular element of the overall idea that that book is concerned with. So essentially, Book 1 is concerned with a couple of major things. The first is, of course, defining what politics means, what the scope of politics is. And the second is to consider questions of power, authority, and subjugation. So Aristotle starts out here giving us kind of a definition and a purpose for community, for the city-state, and for the political. So he starts, we see that every city-state is a community of some sort, and that every community is established for the sake of some good. For everyone performs every action for the sake of what he takes to be good. Clearly then, while every community aims at some good, the community that has the most authority of all and encompasses all of the others aims highest. That is to say, at the good that has the most authority of all. This community is the one called a city-state, the community that is political. So, in other words, communities of different kinds form around a quest for the good, whatever that good happens to be, whether that is, and whatever community that happens to be. So different communities seek different forms of the good. A household forms to seek one kind of good, a village forms to seek another kind of good, a city-state forms to seek another kind of good, a nation forms to seek another kind of good, etc., etc. But he says the community that has the most authority of all and encompasses all the others aims highest, that is to say, at the good that has the most authority of all. So essentially what he's saying here right from the outset is politics is the highest form of good because it encompasses all of the goods that exist in lower levels. So because a city-state is made up of villages or neighborhoods, because it's made up of households, etc., etc., the city-state is all-encompassing of these things. And while he does mention nations in here, they're not really central because nations weren't as important in the ancient Greek world as they are in, say, today, in 2022, for instance. So we might say today the nation-state rather than the city-state, although whether or not the same principles necessarily apply when you sort of bump it up that additional level is an open question. The other thing that Chapter 1 of Book 1 does is it lays out Aristotle's methodology. And this methodology is pretty standard Aristotelian stuff. Like, I've talked about this in other videos about Aristotle's work, especially I think about rhetoric, or about poetics. Aristotle is a classifications guy. He loves classifying things. He loves saying these are the characteristics of it, and that those characteristics tell us what this thing is. So essentially that's what he's doing here. He says, a composite has to be analyzed until we reach things that are incomposite, since these are the smallest parts of the whole. So if we also examine the parts that make up a city-state, we shall see better both how these differ from each other and whether or not it is possible to gain some expertise in connection with each of the things we have mentioned. So this is why Aristotle starts with what the rest of Book 1 is focused on, which is these fundamental relationships of authority. And in particular, he's concerned with 3 different relationships of authority. And this idea is introduced in chapter 3. The idea that the basic relationships of authority, of mastery and subjugation, are of the master and slave, a husband and wife, and father and children. So these are the central things that Aristotle is initially concerned with, because for him these are the basic building blocks of a city-state, of the political. These are the things that without these relationships you can't eventually build up to the city-state. And so he wants to look at these things first in order to understand them, because the way that relationships between masters and slaves, husbands and wives, and fathers and children function tells us how authority works naturally. And Aristotle has a particular sense of the natural that's open to interpretation. We'll put it that way. You could disagree with him about what does and doesn't count as natural within his philosophical outlook. But the other thing he talks about here is, he introduces this at the beginning of chapter 3, is the idea of wealth acquisition as a key component of human interaction within a society, really a defining part of society. But Aristotle first takes us into the question of masters and slaves. Why are some people masters and some people slaves? And he asserts here, it is clear from these considerations what the nature and capacity of a slave are. For anyone who, despite being a human, is by nature not his own, but someone else's, is a natural slave. And he is someone else's when, despite being human, he is a piece of property, and a piece of property is a tool for action that is separate from its owner. So basically, Aristotle doesn't think that it's immoral to have slaves. He doesn't condemn slavery as a system, and indeed slavery was pervasive throughout the ancient Greek world. But basically his understanding is that because of the slave's particular psychological or personal makeup, they are more fitted to be a tool used by someone else, i.e. their master, than they are to themselves be a master. This comes back up later on when Aristotle is talking about women and children and why they are also inferior to free men. Basically, he has this idea that the soul, and sort of like in Book 10 of Plato's Republic, there's no real attempt to prove that the soul actually exists here. It's just sort of assumed that the soul exists and that it has particular component parts. But basically what he argues in chapter 13 of Book 1 is that the souls of free men, slaves, women, and children each have the same component parts, but either some of those component parts are underdeveloped, which is the case particularly with children, like children. And by children, we really get the sense that he means sons more than daughters. But children will someday become fully developed and therefore will be in a position to be masters themselves. For women, their rational part is less developed or oriented toward subservience towards men. The same thing for slaves. Their rational part is either underdeveloped or oriented toward service to their masters. So this is a theory of natural slavery based on the idea of differing compositions of the soul. Not differing in kind, but differing in degree. So that's Aristotle's view of this. The other big thing that he talks about in this book is the idea of household management and wealth acquisition, the nature of wealth in particular. So and this is really fascinating because this is almost the same kind of thing that Marx goes on to say 2,100 years later, roughly. So one of the points that Aristotle makes is that there are different uses that goods can be put to, one of which is what Marx would call their use value. If I have a jacket and I use that jacket to keep warm, to keep the rain off of me, to look stylish, whatever it is, then I am getting the use value of that jacket. But I can also sell that jacket or trade that jacket, at which point I get whatever value I can get for it. So Aristotle says that this is an unnatural use of goods. What Marx called the use value, this is a natural use of goods. If I wear the jacket, then that I'm using it in a natural way. But if I barter or sell the jacket, I'm using it in an unnatural way. Now, this is significant because this idea of bartering or selling leads to commerce. And what Aristotle says here is wealth acquisition is concerned primarily with money, and that its task is to be able to find sources from which a pile of wealth will come. So again, this takes us further and further away from the natural use of goods, which is consumption of them because in order to meet particular needs. So farming, you farm in order to grow food, crops to feed your family, whatever it is. Once you start selling those crops, particularly if you sell them for money, because he does here say, on the other hand, it is also held that money itself is nonsense and wholly conventional, not natural at all. This is Marxist commodity fetishism, the idea that money has value because we collectively imagine it to have value. But if you actually sort of take a dollar, the physical dollar bill, for instance, and remove it from a system in which we all believe that it has value, there's nothing really you can do with it. Like, you could blow your nose, maybe, but it's not even really good for that. So the actual physical thing itself doesn't make sense. What it does is build an unnatural system wherein particular signs, particular coins, in the case of Aristotle, because he talks about stamping coins, but dollars, euro, yen, yuan, whatever it is, those things have value only to the extent that we all believe they have value. Now, for Aristotle, that's a problem because it takes us further and further away from a natural system in which things function according to what they are actually good for. And part of the issue with this is that commerce aims not at the good necessarily, but it aims at the acquisition of wealth. So because this is the particular objective of commerce, because the goal is to make as much money as possible apart from any particular objective that money is going to, it is an antisocial behavior, in essence. Now, Aristotle is not simplistic about this. This isn't an absolute condemnation of commerce and of earning money, because he does tell us the story of Thales of Miletus. And I want to share the story with you because I think it's actually a really, really funny story, even though I'm basically opposed to the moral lesson of this story. So Aristotle says here, for instance, there's the scheme of Thales of Miletus. This is a scheme for getting wealthy which, though credited to him on account of his wisdom, is in fact quite generally applicable. People were reproaching Thales for being poor, claiming that it showed his philosophy was useless. Thales was a philosopher, by the way, in case you didn't pick that up. The story goes that he realized through his knowledge of the stars that a good olive harvest was coming. So, while it was still winter, he raised a little money and put a deposit on all the olive presses in Miletus and Chios for future lease. He hired them at a low rate because no one was bidding against him. When the olive season came and many people suddenly sought olive presses at the same time, he hired them out at whatever rate he chose. He collected a lot of money, showing that philosophers could easily become wealthy if they wished, but that this is not their concern. So I like that story a lot. I think it's very, very interesting. And, you know, it's always good when a philosopher gets one over on the haters. But, again, this is the view that Aristotle takes of what we might call economics in Book 1 of Politics. It's a complicated one, but generally he is more inclined to see value in producing goods that you use directly or that have a particular functional value. Again, this is all within the context of trying to figure out the basic logic of what makes a city-state, what makes the realm of politics as such comprehensible.